I see 5:30 p.m. I see quite a few commissioners here, in fact, almost all of us. I believe we are ready to start the public meeting for August 9th, 2022. Looking over what I have, I would like to hear reports. Mr. Mitchell, would you be willing to start us off?
Nothing to report.
Thank you. Mr. Abad?
Yes, the Citizen Transportation Advisory Committee met on July 20th, and we went over three things mainly. The first being an update on the smart scale applications. It was what was presented to us, except the 5th Street, basically, that we decided to take out for further exploration. We looked at an interactive map that VDOT had, which I didn't know existed, where you can go online and check potential safety improvements across the area. And the last thing was we had an update on the regional transit vision plan, with the main kind of fallout from that is that the Charlottesville Albemarle MPO is putting together a 2050 long-range transit vision plan technical working group, and I believe planning commissioner is going to be a part of that working group too. That's it for me. Thanks.
Would you be willing to send that website to the commission
Yes.
email? Thank you. Mr. Alejandro, please.
Since our last meeting, the Board of Architectural Review met July 19th. We had a very busy meeting. We had 9 certificates of appropriateness to go through, and we approved all of them. We also approved a motion recommending that City Council approve the individual property designation for the former Trinity Episcopal Church property, which is now owned by Dairy Holdings. So hopefully that'll be moving forward. The Tree Commission met just last week, August 2nd. Tim Beatley, who's a professor in the Department of Urban and Environmental Planning at UVA, he gave a very good presentation on innovative tree conservation in cities. And a couple things came out, or to me at least, that existing mature trees are exponentially more important to the environment and human health than replacing them with new trees. And that several U.S. cities have ordinances that allow relief from zoning requirements to preserve existing trees when they're important. And I've got a list of those cities if it would be helpful. Crystal Ridenvold, manager of the city's Environmental Sustainability Division, made a presentation on her department's responsibilities and current projects. An RFP for the mall tree study has been reviewed by Tree Commission and will soon be issued. The Relief Seaville Committee, part of the Tree Commission, has been working with Charlottesville High School to create a volunteer student group to assist in tree planting efforts in the city, a way of getting more better participation by city residents to start planting trees. And they also had a tree education booth recently at the African American Cultural Arts Festival in Washington Park. And then lastly, new nominations for tree conservation designation of street trees will be going soon to City Council. Thank you.
Would you be willing to share that list of cities with the list?
Share what?
That list of cities that have the...
Oh, yes, I'd be glad to.
That would be helpful. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Ms. Russell?
No reports.
Mr. Stolzenberg?
No reports.
I have a long report, so I hope you will have patience with me. First, I would like to discuss our annual appointment of a nomination committee to consider a new chair and vice chair. Considering the tenure of who we have, I believe the best choices would be Isaiah Mitchell and Rory Stolzenberg. I hope that you will accept and meet and consider how to find the best chair and vice chair going forward. I'm seeing nods and thumbs.
Yeah.
I'll take it. Thank you very much. At this time, I would like to present the resolutions for the commissioners who are leaving us. Whereas Ms. Tania Dowell served on the Charlottesville Planning Commission from August 2014 to August 2022. Whereas Ms. Dowell served as the Planning Commission representative to the Community Development Block Grant Task Force and on the School Board of Capital Improvements Plan Committee. And whereas Ms. Dowell has been an advocate for existing neighborhoods within the city and has consistently encouraged fellow commissioners to consider the impact on areas adjacent to new development. And whereas Ms. Dowell has continuously been mindful of the impact of development decisions on underserved populations within the Charlottesville community. Now therefore, we, the City Council of the City of Charlottesville, the Planning Commission too, do hereby thank Ms. Tania Dowell for her dedicated service on the Charlottesville Planning Commission and wish her success in future endeavors. Additionally, whereas Mr. Jody Lahendro served on the Charlottesville Planning Commission from August 2014 to August 2022, serving as chairman from September 2016 to September 2017, and vice chairman from September 2013 to September 2016. And whereas Mr. Lahendro served as the Planning Commission representative to the Board of Architectural Review, the Parks and Recreation Advisory Committee, the Tree Commission, the Planning and Coordination Council Technical Committee, the Housing Advisory Committee, and the Seaville Plans Together Steering Committee. I'm tired. And whereas Mr. Lahendro used his professional experience to encourage high-quality design within the Charlottesville community. And whereas Mr. Lahendro provided many years of service and leadership to the Planning Commission in preparation for and active participation in commission meetings, now therefore, we, the City Council of the City of Charlottesville and the Planning Commission, do hereby thank Mr. Jody Lahendro for his years of dedicated service on the Charlottesville Planning Commission, and wish him success in his future endeavors.
Thank you. Thank you. Although I have to make a correction, I've never been chairman.
Really?
I avoided
he
that
wouldn't do
like
it.
the plague.
It was a beautiful dream. I was surprised to read it.
We tried.
Yeah, they.
Over and over again, we tried.
I believe it completely.
But I've got white out.
Oh. Do I get to give this out?
You can give it to him.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
An honor.
My honor, believe me, and privilege.
Ms.
So
Dowell?
before Jody, because hopefully you're gonna say something really wise and give me something else to think about. As you always do, I just want to point out that, a tremendous amount of wisdom, talent, dedication, institutional knowledge is about to walk out the door. And I am one of the people that are going to have to fill your shoes. You and Tania were mighty oaks, and your roots ran very, very deep. And I'm one of the folks that are going to have to become the mighty oak now. And that's frightening because my roots don't run so deep. But the example that Tania has provided over the years, she's been the social conscience of our board, always reminding us to think about the effects of the developments to the underserved neighborhoods. She's also been an example, being a single mother, and also doing the work that she does in her 9-to-5, very important work to our community. And also working on the board and all the committees that she works on. She's just been an incredible example. So Tania, if you're listening, thank you. And you, again, I wasn't kidding when I said I always go to Jody and say, Jody, what do I think? And sometimes,
Can I get you in trouble with
sometimes you tell me what I think, and sometimes I was like, nah, I don't think that. but
You're a wise man.
you, what I really appreciate about you is your thoughtfulness and your level-headedness. An example of your thoughtfulness is your response to the document that James distributed earlier, this last week, I think it was. Your response, your endorsement of the diagnostic report, but then your subsequent suggestion that maybe we need to rethink about the analysis that we did, and we maybe need to give some thought to what we're testing and how we go about testing it. That's just an example of what we're going to lose when you walk out the door. So, dude, you're the man. Thank you.
You're very kind. You're very kind. Are you putting me on the spot?
That's his job.
If you
I
wish to
just
say
wanna
a
say
few
thank
words,
you.
you would be most welcome.
Well, I mean, the upheaval of the last 8 years, I mean, I can't believe what we've been through. What I've been through, Tania has been through over the last 8 years, and Missy and all the staff, especially the last 5. The light that was shown and is still being shown on some very ugly past actions by the city in its planning. And just knowing that we need to keep learning keep looking at it, keep analyzing it, keep learning that past, learn from the past, and use those lessons in making decisions going forward. We can't change the past, and we shouldn't be penalizing people who did not make the decisions that were made in the past, but we should be learning from it and learning how to apply it to the incredibly diverse community that Charlottesville is. So that's all I have to say.
You're here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jody.
Thank you. I hope I didn't let you down with this. My last comment.
We'll be calling you.
All right, but it's been a pleasure and a privilege, and it's my honor to serve with all of you, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you. Please don't be a stranger. Your
Yeah.
ideas and thoughts are always welcome.
You're very kind, thank you.
And Ms. Dowell, you are much missed. If you wish to share some final thoughts with us, we would certainly appreciate them.
Who are you talking to?
Ms. Dowell,
Yeah, she's on, I think she's on.
I think she might be watching something. It's
Oh,
possible.
oh,
If not now, then in the future.
No, no,
Future Denise.
no.
At this time, I would like to hear from the public. I see we do have some people in the room. I'd like to share some brief thoughts just to sort of structure your ideas. The business this evening will be an opportunity for the commission to discuss the diagnostic report. The general comment period remains open until the end of August, so this is not the deadline. This meeting will be completed no later than 10 p.m. Should we have extra time at the end, I will ask for additional public comment then as well. So public comment at this time, you may address any issue you want. We have no public hearings, so please.
All right, we'll start with having one person in the room, and then we'll alternate with our virtual audience. So we have a couple of members of the public who are physically here. Would anyone like to speak? We'll do raise hands, and then we'll take them in order. All right. Mr. Emery, would you want Ms. Keller to speak? All right, and then after Ms. Keller, we'll go, if you're interested in our virtual audience in speaking during matters from the public this evening, please raise your hand virtually. I don't think we have anyone on the phone, so I don't think we need the instructions for that, but yes, raise your hand. And at this point, we'll have Ms. Keller come up and speak.
Good evening, everyone. Chair Lyle, commissioners, colleagues. I came for 3 reasons tonight, and the first is the most important, which was to join you in honoring my former colleagues, Jody Lehendro and Tania Dow. For several years, I sat between the two of them, and I know I was just the bologna in the sandwich. And what was said tonight about both of them is so true, and I ask you not to forget their legacy and their wisdom and the things that they said. Sometimes just take a breath and say, well, what would Tania have said? Or what would Jody have said? Because although you have exceptional people joining you, they won't be Tania and Jody. And sometimes in the past, we've lost the wisdom of former commissioners. I think in particular of Herman Key, who spoke so eloquently and acted it out in his life for universal accessibility. And I think that's something that we haven't kept up. And so I think we need to have that collective wisdom. And so I ask you to think back to Jody and Tania and what they've brought to this process, because they've both been exceptional, and it was my honor and privilege to serve with them and also some of you. I wanted to speak to 2 other things as well. I haven't finished my review of the diagnostics, and I appreciate you for being where you are now. My inbox was filling up from people this week. And so in the spirit of my earlier remarks, I'd like to ask you to, among other things, take a look at how you're trying to streamline slopes and entrance corridor. I know that there is a real need and desire to streamline what staff does. I'm sympathetic to that. But I also think there is a role for the public, and sometimes the entrance corridor or the slopes is the only way that the public gets to know about a project. And so I would ask you to try to think of ways to keep the public involved. I don't know if that means putting it on the consent agenda or having a small committee of 2 of you that are working with staff, particularly when staff comes and goes, and commissioners in general have been here some time and know those areas very well. I think I'm disappointing Bill because I'm not going to say anything technical. There are times when I sort of let down on the slope ordinance, particularly for the firehouse, because I felt there was a community need for the firehouse. But people like Kay Slaughter wrote and spoke so eloquently and technically proficiently about the need for a slope ordinance. And, you know, slopes are about more than managing water. We live in Virginia's Piedmont. Our street names, Ridge Street, other streets that are, named for our topography. It's part of our identity. It's not aesthetics. It's not corridors. It's really part of our identity, and we don't want to just be retaining walls. So think of some ways to keep this going in the spirit of your comments earlier. So thank you for letting me be with you tonight. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Do we have anyone from online?
Another opportunity if anyone online would like to raise their hand. All right, not at this time. Mr. Emery?
Thank you all for your work, and particular thanks to Jody. So what Jenny was talking about, the removing critical slopes review from the zoning ordinance and making it through a technical matter that staff reviews is, I believe it's really important, the continued involvement of the Plan Commission and the council with critical slopes, as it keeps those affected residents of Charlottesville who elected councilors in the loop. Critical slopes are but more than technical staff review of stormwater. And if you look at the ordinance, there are things other than water that can be considered by council when granting a waiver, like large stands of trees, rock outcroppings, slopes greater than 60%. I think we want to continue to incorporate those things. There are an undisclosed number of environmental superstars that work for the city of Charlottesville. Crystal Rivervold, Susan Elliott, Dan, I'm going to mess up names, so I won't keep on going, but there are those people out there. But it's my observation the culture of city management does not generally support the environment and views topography as a nuisance. I could get into all kinds of stories that observation's based on, but the one that I guess I'll touch on, because Jenny mentioned it, the fire station. It needed to be built. I actually made a motion to approve it October 13th, 2009. And I think my motion included, it's conditioned with find another 237 feet somewhere in the Moores Creek watershed and daylight streams and pipes, and that 237 feet doesn't have to be contiguous, doesn't have to be on the property, and do it in the next 5 years. The COO of Charlottesville argued against me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not gonna name him. The lawyer of Charlottesville argued against me. Engineering staff belittled me. I have a recording of the meeting if anybody's interested. It's really important to make this a place that's worth caring about. And part of that is to be able to walk on the street from the Woolen Mills to downtown and not be in the sun the whole time. We actually had a plan for that in 1975. Where are the networks? Where's the green ring? Where's the biophilic city that supports the residents? Thank you.
Thank you.
right, do we have anyone in our virtual audience that is interested in speaking? All right, seeing no one at this time, are there other members of our in-person public that would be interested in speaking at this time?
Seeing
All
none,
right.
I would like to close down public comment.
Okay.
At this time, I would like to consider the consent agenda, a set of minutes. Ms. Russell, do you have thoughts on that?
Yes, I move to approve the consent agenda as presented.
Can I get thumbs up on that? I see thumbs.
Mr. Chair,
Please.
did we miss the NDS report, or are we just folding that into the general zoning update discussion?
It's possible that we missed the NDS report, yes. I wouldn't, commit to it. I wonder, do we have a report from NDS? And thank you for that.
We will, I'll give you some highlights of some of the meetings that are coming up, and then we'll have more to come for the rest of the meeting. So we have our regular September meeting that will come up on the 13th. And then on September 27th, that is a joint work session with City Council, where we will be discussing the diagnostic report further. At that point, we will have the public comment that has been received by the end of August. And so that'll be combined into updating that report. And the goal of that meeting will be to work on moving forward to the drafting step of the project. So those are kind of crucial. We also have a steering committee meeting on August 29th. Jody will be moving on. So I know that Mr. Stoltenberg noted that at one point that you might be available for that. If not, I'm sure we can find a commissioner that will be able to support that meeting.
So do you not want me there then?
Oh, you could go.
No, I just assumed I had till the 31st of August.
Well, you know what? Let's go.
Okay,
Let's go.
I'll be there.
All right, sounds good. So, so we have a couple of milestones going on with that. We also have, I'm not going to take all of James's thunder. We do have a road show on this report that's going to different groups. I'm going to one later in the week. James has done a few. So that's another way that we're getting out the word and gathering comments in addition to what people submit in other means. So that is our general update. We understand at this point that we will be maintaining this meeting type status into the fall. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but just plan on the next couple of meetings being in this similar format. So that's it.
Thank you. Getting myself reorganized here. At this time, I would like to move to consideration of the zoning diagnostic and approach report. Mr. Freeze, can you start us off? There you are. Hello.
I don't know what else I have to say. No.
I was holding back.
Let's go home.
All right, so we do have a presentation I'm going to run through. I understand for many of you, this will be kind of high level. This is the same presentation or version of the presentation that we're going to be using as we meet with neighborhood groups or other groups, what have you. And Patrick, are we up? There we go. All right. You ready? Yeah. Did we work out a signal? All right, here we go. So the agenda for tonight is pretty self-explanatory. We're going to introduce the overall topic again. We'll go through the draft report. We'll talk about our engagement process, and then we'll move into discussion. But what I really want to say is what I'm looking for tonight from you, from members of the Planning Commission, from from the counselor, mayor, is, what, I'm looking for guidance, but in particular, I'm looking for what are your remaining questions? Where are the things that we could clarify? Where are the things we could expand upon? The public comment period, as Missy mentioned, is going to run through to the end of the month, and then we're going to be moving to update this draft report into a final draft to take to both the Planning Commission and Council. So what we hear from you, what we hear from the public is going to be reflected in that final draft going forward. So, Patrick, slide, please. So, as we know, this is the third step in the CVille Plans Together process. We have the Affordable Housing Plan that was adopted in March of 2021, the Comprehensive Plan from November of 2021, and now we're moving into our updated zoning ordinance. Slide. Thank you. So what is zoning? I think everybody here has a pretty decent idea, but zoning is that set of regulations and tools that define buildings the buildings that can be built, the building space as opposed to open space, and then how land can be used. Can we have brickyards in residential neighborhoods? Effectively, one of the initial questions that zoning answers for us. Slide. Our comprehensive plan, affordable housing plan, small area plan, all of those under the umbrella of the comprehensive plan. Zoning ordinance is intended to implement those planning documents. It's in fact one of our primary tools for that purpose, along with our budget, our CIP, and other actions that the city takes. Slide. And what does it mean for us to be rewriting the zoning ordinance? There's three major things that we're looking to get out of this. Obviously, that first one is supporting the comprehensive plan, supporting implementation of the comprehensive plan and the other plans that we have. But it's also addressing various challenges, problems that we've identified over time with this existing zoning ordinance, and there are a few. And then finally, this is creating a new zoning ordinance that's easier to read and apply. And that's true for everyone. That's true for staff, but most importantly, it's true for the general public. We want a zoning ordinance that is going to be a document someone can readily refer to and understand what they can do with their property or what could possibly happen in their neighborhood or at the end of the street. Some sections of the zoning ordinance will be completely rewritten, many of them. Some sections we may just adapt or utilize existing text and bring that forward. And then, as we've noted a number of times before, but I believe it's important to continue to reiterate, when we come forward for the adoption of the plan, we will be considering potential changes to the land use map as well. As we go through this learning and engagement process, are there changes that make sense within the comprehensive plan that we would bring forward in conjunction with the zoning ordinance? I should note there may also be changes to other ordinances that make sense when we get to that stage, that would be kind of parallel and complementary to this new zoning ordinance. So when we talk about implementing the comprehensive plan, we're talking about the vision from the comprehensive plan. I'm not going to read all of the words on the slide here, but we're talking about affordable housing, as we have been throughout this entire process. Addressing inequities, as Mr. Lahedra spoke about earlier. Walkable, people-focused, additional, protecting the natural environment. And then significantly, working with our existing urban design, historic preservation in pursuit of all these other goals. And then when we look at the goals and strategies, nope, you were good, thanks. When we look at the goals and strategies of the plan, there's a lot of words that kind of to be highlighted, right? Again, walkability, climate change, context-sensitive design, transitions in scale and use, reducing approval times. These are all kind of key words from the strategies that make up the land use chapter and all things that ought to be reflected in the zoning ordinance as we move forward. Go ahead, thanks. So just a quick overview of our process. Again, this is something all of you are familiar with, but we're right now, we're approaching the end of the first part of this, which is identifying the zoning ordinance changes that are needed in order to be consistent with and implementing our comprehensive plan and proposing an approach to getting there. Noting here, we did some of the building modeling. Housing market outcomes is coming, along with the inclusionary zoning ordinance. We should have that report available for the public next week. And we already talked about the 27th, so yeah, we move on. Following September, we're going to move into drafting the zoning ordinance itself. We are aiming to have that ordinance, we're aiming to maintain this schedule shown here of having a public version of that draft zoning ordinance available in early 2023. We may be, depending on where we get, we may release it in 3 pieces, 1 being the districts and uses, 2 being the standards, and 3 being process and procedures. And then if we go to part 3, next slide, Patrick. Thank you. We move into the adoption phase. And again, we are aiming for spring of 2023. I will note spring runs all the way through June 21st. So.
In the afternoon.
All the way to the end of the day. Thank you. Slide, please. So here's just a graphic of the overall schedule, taking us through to spring. Thanks, Patrick. All right. So then this is the overview of the report. So as we've noted, the document identifies issues with the current zoning ordinance and our proposed approach. Notably, we don't have a draft zoning map right now. We don't have draft zoning text. I've referred to this as our measure twice, cut once approach. The first measure, the first body of response that we're getting is through this high-level kind of conceptual plan of the zoning zoning ordinance. So, and again, as Missy outlined, our comment period is going to end at the end of this month, and then we'll be preparing for the meeting at the end of September. Slide, please. So I'm just going to highlight 3 kind of core, kind of the meat of the report as we have it right now. The affordable housing section, the district testing, and the better zoning standards section. Slide, please. So, again, we know and we've talked about at length that the significant housing challenges within the city, and there's some quotes here from the affordable housing plan and the comprehensive plan that speak to what we need to do within the zoning ordinance towards addressing these issues. I'm not going to read all of those, but slide, please. So kind of the key ideas, the core ideas that are presented in this report are, of course, allowing more units on every lot, creating or allowing more rental and ownership options within what you can do on a lot. So we're talking about different building types. We're talking about different configurations of ownership and land. We're talking about creating zoning incentives and an adoption of an inclusionary zoning policy. I'll come back to that in a little more detail. Then creating a toolkit to avoid displacing at-risk communities. One of the things I want to note here on this point is that there's been a number of comments around when we talk about protecting or preventing displacement as construing that as somehow protecting these vulnerable communities from change, and that is not what we're talking about. There will be opportunities for redevelopment in these communities, but the idea is how do we protect the people who live within that neighborhood from displacement? Or to put it another way, how do we create opportunities for the people who live in that neighborhood to continue to live in that neighborhood, right? We know and are experiencing that gentrification is what happens when people are pushed out. They no longer have a place, they no longer can afford to live within the community. And that's the issue we're trying to address. This is not about preventing development or redevelopment in those neighborhoods. It's about making sure there's an opportunity for those, for the people who live in a given neighborhood to be able to stay in that neighborhood. Slide, please. Thank you. So inclusionary zoning is a aspect of, or a part of our zoning ordinance that would require projects meeting a certain threshold of size to include affordable units within the project. part of the report that we'll be releasing next week is digging deep into real estate market conditions so that we can understand what is the extent of public benefit, because the affordable units are essentially public benefit. What is the extent of public benefit we can extract from these projects without effectively killing the projects themselves, right? Our rules of thumb as we move into this, we're seeking the greatest level of affordability, that is market viable. We're aiming for 60% of AMI. That's what we want to get to, requiring 60% of AMI. We have to see what the market can support. And thus, the financial analysis is being conducted and will be released next week. Two other principles I want to highlight here at the bottom two. One is ensuring that our program aligns with fair housing principles. That's one of the things that we hear a lot, and really that's about how do we ensure where there may be disparities in the rental of market rate units in terms of how biases and how decisions are made as to who to rent to. We want to ensure that those biases, obviously we don't want those biases to exist in any units, but in particular we want to make sure that they don't exist within the affordable units, and in the affordable units is where we have an opportunity to take a stronger hand in ensuring that there's no bias in who gets to live in a household, in a new affordable unit. And then the other key thing that we're aiming for here is to ensure that the units that are created through this program are affordable as long as possible, in perpetuity if we can get to it. Right? And that in and of itself will also be a big change from where we are today. And that's to ensure that we're not constantly chasing an affordable housing. We're always adding, we're not trying to make up for lost units in the past. So you can think about inclusionary zoning in some respects as a whole bunch of knobs on dials, if you will, like a sound mixing board or something of that nature, where you require greater affordability. You may need to drop something else to get there. Number of units, for example, that are required, right? The percentage of the units in the overall project. Where that increases, something else may come down. That's kind of the balancing act that we'll see when this thing comes forward. Slide, please. So the residential district testing. Essentially what that section is looking at is what is the maximum development potential of lots that represent essentially typical lots across the city, with note about the suburban curvilinear street lots, well taken. What we want to emphasize though is not necessarily the likely development on each one of these lots, but what the consultants we're trying to understand with this is what's the maximum potential, and what does that teach us about what these standards potentially need to be as we're considering the building types and again, the standards that would be applied within the zoning ordinance. What's important to remember is that each lot is unique, and it's going to be lot characteristics that drive the development potential of a given lot. And one of the things, one of the reasons that we didn't look at curvilinear streets to a certain extent was recognizing that that's another site condition which in many cases is going to limit what can be developed on the site, or on the other hand, might enhance what can be developed on the site. But we mostly were focused on these kind of standard lots and what could be done there. But recognizing that, again, all of these factors up here effectively limit what can happen. And then, of course, there's financial considerations that limit, and that's the topic of the report that we're releasing next week, the second topic of the report we're releasing next week. Slide, please. So this is just an example of one of the pages, again, showing a maximum development potential on a corner lot. So, and then finally, better zoning standards. And this really gets into a lot of real technical zoning details. I am looking for my page of notes on this, I'm sorry. There we go. So in the zoning districts chapter or section of this chapter are the recommended changes around consolidating the number of zoning districts and improving how the ordinance handles issues like height, setbacks, lot size, and similar standards. We had some questions about those things, and we'll dive into some of those more specifics later. But what we're aiming for is a consistent set of standards, but also something that offers a degree of flexibility. And I'll come back to that point in a minute. Use provisions, how can we consolidate the uses that we have within our existing ordinance, simplify the uses defined, and also take into account more modern uses, which our ordinance is missing a few. The site standards are recommended set of changes to address our goals within the comprehensive plan around historic preservation, environmental protection. This includes incentives for keeping existing buildings, tree protection, bicycle parking, and what I expect will be an in-depth conversation around reducing or eliminating car parking requirements. Our administration section has recommended changes to improve and expedite the review process, particularly around the clarity of the review criteria. Basically, what does it take to get something approved? And are we actually being fully clear about what that means and what it takes? And the idea of more by right development is addressed in this section, as well as updating the ordinance to reflect changes in state law. And then finally, as I've mentioned before, ease of use. We got a number of recommended changes around, including more illustrations, more tables and graphics, using plain language drafting, so that the ordinance is understandable to your everyday resident of the city. Slide, please. All right, so this is the last section, talking about QB engagement and involvement process. Given that much of this was already covered, I don't feel like I'm going to go into this in depth. We're following the goals and objectives of the comprehensive plan in our community engagement chapter, last chapter of the comprehensive plan. Slide, please. We're using a variety of engagement methods. We've gotten a great deal of virtual engagement, particularly in the last couple of weeks. We are expanding our in-person engagement. We've done 2 pop-up tables at events so far this summer. And we have a number of presentations to neighborhood associations and groups coming up over the next several weeks. And all the normal email, social media, etc. available. Oh, and I want to note, that's our event at the Ting Pavilion. We had approximately 200 people come through, which was a pretty good turnout for late June. What is that, end of spring, I think, time period. And overall, I think it was a very good event. I know there were a lot of good conversations held around the tables and throughout the, what did we do it for? 4 hours, 4 to 8 p.m. So, slide, please. And here are some of the ways that people can engage with this process going forward. Again, we're aiming to close out, we are closing out the comment period on this particular document on August 31st. Now, of course, this process isn't going to end at the end of the summer. There will be plenty of opportunity for continued comments, and of course, we'll continue to accept comments. But getting them in through by the end of the 31st means that we're more likely to be read and potentially reflected within the finalized report. And that's it for the formal presentation. Let me pause there for questions, and then I can dive into some of the questions that you all had for us. But why don't I start with questions from that?
Questions for staff on this?
I guess my one question is in sort of determining like what's in scope and what's out of scope for these sort of tangentially related things. I mean, in the diagnostic report, it seems to me that some things like were separate from zoning, but seemed in scope, and then in the appendix and later stuff, it seemed less in scope. For example, you know, if we were to make changes to the critical slopes ordinance and put stuff into the water protection ordinance, you know, I would hope that we would make those additions to the water protection ordinance at the same time, right?
Right. We would need to do that simultaneously, right? Right.
And then like SADM stuff, would that be in scope or is that separate?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure the answer. I think that's something we should look into, yeah.
Okay. And then subdivision, we talk about zoning lots versus legal lots.
Yep.
Is it safe to assume that those changes will be made at the same time?
Yeah, we
Okay.
would need to.
Additional questions on this? Please proceed.
All right, so, in your packets, there was a memo, and the goal of this memo was to answer some of the questions that we got from commissioners over the course of the month of July. I realized as I was looking at this today, a couple things. One, that I purposefully did not include your questions in this memo because I thought I'd just kind of anonymize it and group things together, but I'm not sure all of the answers. Actually, some of them may seem like they imply that there's a questions everyone can see in the answers, so I apologize for that. Why don't we do this? I'd actually really prefer, rather than me just presenting this, that we just kind of do this more conversationally, right? So there were questions raised around the entrance corridor rules. I'm just going to start there. I'm going to say a little bit, and then I'll let y'all can respond as you like. The proposal that's in the report is not to get rid of the entrance corridor rules outright, but to incorporate them into the base zoning requirements and remove the review process that you guys engage in right now. And I'll note here and probably multiple times that there's no proposed change to the BAR, the Board of Architectural Review process inherent in that. So why don't I pause there and see if there's any.
So, questions about that? It looks like you are attempting to remove some of the discretion that the ECRB would have on these, and it would be a more technical review.
It would be more of a yes or no, consistent or not.
Okay. And again, I'll follow the lead of the architects who had counseled me on this. The entrance corridor review is a review of not just whether a window meets the proper tint, but it also is a review of whether this is consistent with our culture, the aesthetics of our culture. If it's consistent with the politics of our city, is it consistent with Jeffersonian architecture and things like that. And I worry that if we begin leaning on moving towards black and white, we lose some of the aesthetic concerns that again the architects suggested that we ought to have. And I think maybe a compromise that again Kareem and Jody recommended was that you don't take it away from the ECRB, but you at least show us the math and put it in the consent agenda so that we can review it. And if people who are smart about that stuff, again like Jody and Kareem, see something that may be inconsistent with our cultural aesthetics, they can bring it up for review, and we can review that as a board. Jody, you and Kareem can probably be more articulate than I am, but I think that's what I heard you guys say after I suggested a revision.
Who wants to go first?
You can go first.
Well, I don't know if I remember what I said.
Well, you told me what
I'm gonna let you down now. So, yeah, I think one of my concerns is just staff being overworked, and maybe it's the result of the last couple of years when they were overworked, and they were, and what I experienced in the tree commission and site plan reviews, that things were being missed, and and just handled administratively, and then finding out there were problems later on. I just don't want that to get to the point where we're not able to second guess a decision made by staff, that we do represent the opportunity for the public. I'm looking for transparency. And I want there to be transparency and the opportunity for still to question the decision made by the staff.
Right.
So however we can build that into the administrative review process, let us see it in a consent agenda, and let the public see it in a consent agenda through the packet materials ahead of time. Give the opportunity for someone to stand up and say, wait a minute, what about so-and-so? So I'm just looking for more transparency. Kareem, how'd I do?
10 out of 10. No, I completely agree. I think the opportunity for public comment is an important one as part of the ERB. I guess my question was this, just the ARB they don't want to do it, or why is that not being considered as part of their?
BAR.
The BAR, the Board of Architecture Review.
Well, I don't have to say this right. You guys are the ERB.
Yeah.
Okay, I
Really,
realized that, right?
I said ARB by mistake.
One
That's
of the
county. I
questions
meant to
he's
say
asking
ARB.
is, why wouldn't the bar do
Oh, I
this?
see. I'm sorry. I didn't follow.
And one of the comments that has been made to that effect is the BAR works with different guidelines, and so it would be a shift in mindset, which the commission already has to do to go from ERB to planning commission back and forth, but it's a similar concern.
I'll give you guys an example of one of the debates that we had over an entrance corridor review was Emmett Street and University Boulevard and the hotel that burned down. If you remember, there was a raging debate on that, not because of the technical components, because they were going to hear all the technical stuff, but it was an aesthetic question. It was whether we needed to have something more Jeffersonian there or something more contemporary. And these are the kinds of debates that I think you can't make technical debates. These are the kinds of debates that folks who are closer to the people who talk to us every day as we're walking up and down the mall, closer to the politicians who are advising the politicians. This is the kind of input that I think we have to provide you guys with. Again, above and beyond technical, but more cultural and more aesthetic.
So, I mean, I guess part of the question is, if you were to, codify the guidelines, what stays and what's lost? Because something like that, it was, as I recall, it was red brick versus black brick, and they came to us and was like, we could do either, and we had a whole argument about whether to be Jeffersonian or modern. And how does that work at a staff level? I'm assuming that something as extremely just aesthetic as red versus black would be either set in advance and you never vary, or you discard that choice entirely.
Right. You would have to have a set of identified design guidelines for the corridor. Right.
And that could be, I guess, like a set of potentially allowed colors or whatever, but
And the thing that I could get comfortable with, and I'm looking at you guys again, is if we got to recommend what the static guidelines would be for that corridor. If we got to do that, then you guys would adhere to the guidelines that we recommend, then I could easily get comfortable with that. Is that?
Yeah, but I know from the experience with BAR and those guidelines, I mean, there are a lot of gray areas. There's a lot of gray that's contextual. So it's evaluated in context of what else is on that block, what else is on that corner. And that's something that that architects deal with all the time, And so, and it changes from one block to another because the context changes. So there's a lot of gray that I really don't see what the issue is that the BAR can't do corridor reviews also. So it's a different set of guidelines, so that they're smart enough to know that, to use the other guidelines. We're expected to.
Yeah, I
I don't think that's a huge hangup, but.
Something I
And
feel
we're in the
very-
middle of making significant changes anyway, so why not add this to the list of
And,
changes?
and they're used to dealing with contextual gray areas. So I see that as a strong possibility.
I feel very firmly that if we're gonna keep discretionary review, it should be the BAR's problem. And I think they're capable of putting on different hats, just as much as we're capable of putting on different hats,
Yeah.
but they're definitely more capable of evaluating aesthetic concerns, because,
Yeah.
as we know, nobody likes my aesthetic opinions.
No, yeah, that's what I was trying to say. I agree with that. And I think it, you know, part of reviewing the ARB applications is it allows for, you know, you end up with these possibilities for interesting open spaces in reaction to some of our comments of trying to, you know, make it scale appropriate or material appropriate. So you might lose out on all these kind of intricacies by making it this just technical, yes, no, black or white.
Yeah, materials
Process.
change, techniques change, the architectural principles change over time.
Sure.
And if you got a set of guidelines, you're stuck in one place that doesn't allow any gray area.
I think, though, I mean, I think there is some advantage or some disadvantage to having discretionary review and everything, right? Like, then it becomes a crapshoot of like, will they like my red or black? Will it be a gray area, or will they say no gray at all? But not in West Main, gray's definitely allowed there. I think it does create a lot of ambiguity when you can come and say, here's a design, and then people, for completely aesthetic reasons, say, you know, no, I don't like that, or no, I do like that, or change this and change that, and it can create this like very long feedback cycle of, you know, how many times does the BAR defer something on average, right? Until they come to an agreement.
Yeah, and trust me, it happens in the BAR where personal opinions start coming into it when we don't have a guideline that's defending or that's backing it up. So we have to remind each other of that. It's not black and white, like Hosea says. But the BAR is used to working with that, and it has to be a defensible position that has some basis in the guidelines.
So, and what Commissioner Stolzenberg is getting at is the reason this kind of appears is not a question around who does it so much as that discretionary review creates another degree of uncertainty and another length of time and process delay. And so that's the issue that this is raising. What am I?
And then, you know, in terms of that sort of aesthetic gray area stuff, like, would, say, a Jeff Werner be able to make those sort of aesthetic, like, judgments and require changes like that? And if he would,
Administratively.
I would say I trust him as much as, you know, BAR, no offense to them. And like, at least then you're not so deep into like the letter of the rule or the guideline, right? And then to Ms. Keller's point earlier, of like, you know, or there needs to be some way for the public to act, to do something if they think they're wrong. I wonder then if the appropriate mechanism would be something like the current BAR appeal process, where if either the project proposer or a member of the community doesn't like the BAR decision, presumably the member of the community doesn't like the COA and the project person doesn't like the rejection of the COA, then they can make an appeal to council.
Right.
And so you can imagine a system where, you know, people would be notified that an entrance corridor determination was made by staff, and then could, if they thought it was horribly wrong, they could appeal it to the ECRB or council.
Mhm.
And that at least has some amount of public
Or
input.
depend upon a administrative review that, typically what happens now, Jeff gives in the consent agenda, the administrative reviews that he's done, what the issues were, how he reviewed it, and what his decisions were, and gives the BAR the opportunity to pull it from the consent agenda if they have issues with it, or if the client, or if the applicant is saying, no, I don't agree with Jeff's opinion, could the BAR look at it? And then, of course, there's always the appeal process after that, even to add to the BAR's decision.
I guess a question, or maybe a problem with the idea of the consent agenda is like, the consent agenda doesn't, really mean anything except, just to pull something from a consent agenda, anyone can do it, and then it just becomes a regular agenda item. It's not like creating like a presumption of correctness or something. Though maybe that sort of thing would be enough, right? To say, just like, when someone appeals a BAR decision to council, it's up to the appellant to say, BAR was wrong, it didn't comply with the guidelines in this way, this way, this way, to get a determination in their favor. And so if it was, the staff made a determination, then BAR, to pull it from the consent agenda and reject that determination, would have to, affirmatively say, like, the onus would be on saying that staff was wrong. But I mean, again, that's sort of true anyway, right? Like, that's true when it comes to us.
Yeah, well, we've never hesitated to pull something from the consent agenda. Neither is the BAR.
Yeah, so it doesn't really make the whole thing less, less ambiguous, like less likely to result in a whole cycle.
And there's transparency, which is what I've been fighting for.
Ms. Russell, what are your thoughts?
Well, I've been looking through the comprehensive plan, and I think, I think in terms of like public transparency, the comprehensive plan articulates an entrance corridor process existing, and those being, entrance corridors being things we value. So, I am hesitant about taking it out of sort of any kind of discretionary review, but I've always maintained that I think it's more appropriate to go through the BAR and not the Planning Commission as the entrance corridor review board. Whether it's on the consent agenda or not, it's kind of like the same. I don't know that it saves staff any time because they're still doing the reports, they're still making the, staff recommendations. But I think, like you both have said, there's subjectivity that should be discussed.
Mayor Snook, do you have thoughts on this issue?
The only thought that I have is that I am dubious of council's skill in architecture. And I tend to defer to people who know more than I do. And that's one of the reasons why I value the opinions of at least many of you. And I certainly tend to defer to them. So I'm not anxious to have more things come to council.
A question, please.
Ms. Creasy, do the ECRB rulings go to council, or are they solely at the discretion of the ECRB?
The current process, it comes to the planning commission, that's it.
So we can rewrite the thingy so that it goes to the bar, and the bar's decision is, as it is now with us. It comes to us, and our decision is the decision.
Potentially, I mean, an ER,
Right.
that part doesn't have an appeal, whereas a BAR application does have appeal.
But again, we could just transfer the rules as they exist for us over to the BAR, as someone has suggested.
In terms of sort of streamlining and greater clarity, which I think is a good thing no matter which way we go. Something that I've seen Mr. Warner produce in the past is a palette of sort of good ideas. So it could be materials, could be colors. So that sort of resource could be helpful, either to guide staff, to guide the applicant. and to inform the public, oh, this is what is considered acceptable, this is what will work well. And that can be debated, and we may be able to agree that nothing is acceptable. But I suspect some basic ideas we can find broad agreement, and that may be helpful. Any final questions or thoughts on this item?
Yeah, I mean, I think going back to, or maybe disagreeing with my earlier self about moving things to BAR, I do feel like I, again, should not be making aesthetic judgments, but my worry with pushing it to BAR as it is now is that it effectively makes every entrance corridor just as rigorous an architectural review district as all the current architectural review districts. And that maybe BAR is more likely to kind of litigate a lot of those small details and take, several meetings and months to issue a certificate of appropriateness. Whereas we, with our lack of aesthetic expertise, except for Jody and Kareem, I guess, and Liz, I mean, just not me, really, probably less likely to, be hung up on a lot of those sorts of things.
Well,
And
then
so,
why have them if we can't evaluate them? I mean, it shouldn't dumb them down.
I mean, yeah, well, I guess that's the point, right? Like ECRB is kind of a watered down, or entrance corridors themselves are sort of watered down review districts, right? And that's why they don't go to BAR. And that's why I think if we move them to BAR, there needs to be some change in the onus of what needs to be decided, or if there's an assumption that staff was right in making their recommendation, and there needs to be some significant problem to override that. I mean, it could be as simple as maybe a supermajority of the BAR to reject the COA. Or it could be something like an appeal process to send it to BAR in the first place, that someone has to say, wait a second, this isn't good. Of course, then you could get community members potentially, appealing everything, but we don't see that from BAR to council right now. And we do see when something is appealed from BAR to council, the council says, we're not the architecture experts. We assume that BAR is right, and you better have a damn good reason to come to us and say they're wrong. And so I think if you had something like that step from the staff to BAR, I think that would make me feel like we are still streamlining the process, while still allowing for that kind of subjective aesthetic judgment where it's needed.
Additional questions or thoughts on this item? Please.
All right. I think that there was a lot in there that for me to take away, so we'll make some changes and see what we come back, and you guys can judge where we landed. So let's move on to critical slopes, another good one. So at its root, I think the concern around critical slopes is that the analysis that we're asked to do on the waivers is very much kind of a technical stormwater analysis. That's the direction that waiver process kind of takes us, is in that direction. And my limited experience of critical slopes in the time I've been here, what I've heard from engineering frequently is we're not really at that stage yet, right? We're at an earlier stage of the review process. The developer hasn't done the analysis necessary to do this kind of work, and so the engineering doesn't really provide a comment, and we move on, and you guys make a recommendation to council. Now, an interesting comment was made earlier by Ms. Keller about the non-technical aspect, if you will, of critical slopes, right? Because, I mean, I think I should back up and start the conversation by saying we all inherently recognize the value of protecting critical slopes. Like, that's not what's at issue here. It's really just at what stage in the development process does it make sense to do this review? And our argument to date has been that the stage of the development process where this makes sense is during the stormwater review because of the nature of that waiver process. But an interesting comment was made about the nature of critical slopes in terms of how The alternative might be a whole lot of retaining walls around town. And that's a different, character, if you will, for the community. And that there's some role played by this ordinance to prevent that. And frankly, I kind of feel like I need to look into that some more and understand it. But that, what fundamentally changes for me, though, is the nature of the waiver process in any event. Because the waiver process that we have right now, as at least as I've seen it function, is out of step with the point at which a development is when it comes to you guys and to city council for a special permit, which is effective. The critical slope I know is referred to as a waiver, but it functions like a special permit. And that's the point at which most development projects bring that waiver request forward. So just kind of disclosure, that's where my thinking is right now, and I'd welcome other thoughts and comments.
Please.
As you guys know, I'm a stickler for protecting these slopes and protecting these streams at the base. But I do think about a couple things that leap immediately to mind. The fire station is one. The other is the work we did on South First Street for affordable housing. We were not ready. I wasn't around for the fire station, but I was in the middle of the South First Street, and we were definitely not ready to grant the waiver based on the technical review. It was not where it needed to be. But the importance of doing that, and the importance of, I think they had to get a LIHTC approval in the next couple of weeks. And the importance of doing that outweighed the potential danger that we could not come to terms with the developer. And I think it's important that the politicians and the public, with our recommendations, remain involved in making that decision, making the political trade-off. Do we protect the streams, critical slopes, which of course I desperately want to do, but I also want to make certain that, the low-income folks around have a place to live, and we continue to support public housing. As an example. So is there a way to make this discretionary, but make it discretionary at the stormwater management decision point?
What's interesting is I was actually thinking about going the other way, because the critical slope waiver as written asks you to make that balancing act, right? It's basically, the language of the sections asks you to balance other public benefits against the potential damage to the slope, but then it asks you to do this technical analysis as part of that decision. And what I'm wondering now is just strip out the technical analysis, right? We're hardly using it to begin with, and so maybe it's just a values judgment.
Maybe
Recognizing the
I'm not
values
keeping
of-
up. So if we do that, then how do we protect these slopes, and how do we protect these streams at the base of the
Well,
slopes?
a lot of, see, the interesting thing is the stormwater requirements we already have already require that stormwater be managed. Like, that's built into our stormwater ordinance, and I don't know the history. I don't know when the critical slopes ordinance was adopted, but does it predate? I'm getting a nod. It predates the stormwater ordinance. So at the time we adopted the critical slope, with that requirement, we didn't have a stormwater ordinance that provided that protection, right? So we now have a stormwater ordinance that provides that protection that you're speaking of. And so now, maybe what we're really talking about is stepping back the critical slopes decision to one that's more balancing values.
Right, because you could have a project meet all the stormwater requirements, but like Jenny said, if it has massive retaining walls that make the, streetscape uninviting, and it's just, not a place that you want to be, I don't think that's a decision that's fair to put on engineering staff, for example.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. You're basically just taking out what we already recommend every time we get a staff report about all the recommendations on what to do with the super fence and all that stuff. And we just review the critical slopes based on that give and take between what it takes away and what the project provides.
So, essentially, or you're suggesting that we do more or less the same review we do now, except skipping the part where we add conditions and say, Jack, add whatever additional conditions you need to make it good for the environment?
I mean, there may still be conditions. I think, you know, and I'm sure I get corrected later, but I think we've also rolled this into so that it looks more like a typical special permit. As, again, we treat it like a special permit, but then what we call it a waiver. It's just kind of bring that all together. There may be conditions attached to it, but they would be, you know, I don't know what they would be. I can't speculate right now.
Okay.
I'm really kind of going on something that I just started thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the problem with, I think the retaining wall thing is a really good point, but I feel like it's a problem that's broader than critical slopes, right? Like, you can have a slope that's not close to a waterway and then it's not critical. Or even if you look at like that JPA project, there's that giant retaining wall that's like 12 feet tall, that's half a block long. And it's not because of a slope, it's just there. And I wonder if that needs to be addressed in just some other kind of guideline development rule.
Right, true. And I know we do have, well, right now, above a certain height, a retaining wall triggers a building permit. But could there be additional zoning regulations, just strictly speaking about retaining walls? Yeah.
Mr. Alejandro, do you have thoughts on this?
No, we don't.
I'm shocked. Really? Nothing?
No.
To what degree do steep slopes also protect, like, our tree cover as well, you know, and if that's not part of a discretionary review, is that kind of at risk?
I'm sorry, is there a question or comment? Sorry.
Comment with a raising voice at the end.
Yeah,
I mean, definitely another one of those standard conditions.
It'd
It'd
be part of that value statement.
We
that would be
yeah,
made.
we definitely look at, you know, what happens to the canopy when we're looking at this, the critical slope, so that's always a part of this.
And we always require 3-to-1 tree replacement on the slope.
Right.
Pretty much always, I say, every time I've done it, I think. So, I guess the question is, what does that discretionary decision become if it's not, how do we protect our waterways and is this adequate? Like, is the value of this hill
It's the firehouse.
culturally important?
It's the firehouse decision, right? Is it,
Well,
does the
I look
need
at,
outweigh the damage?
I go on 64 and I seen what they're doing in Albemarle County on Pantops Mountain with these incredible retaining walls and what they did at that
That's
shopping
great.
center development out there that Fifth Street.
Mhm.
Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And they're god awful, that they change the whole nature of the topography of the land, they create these artificial environments. And you could do the same thing for, you know, managing stormwater on a site. But once again, just because it's expensive, and just because you can, you know, maybe the development should be more attuned to the site and be more responsive to the site. So I don't know what that looks like in the regulation though.
Yeah, that almost makes it sound like it should be an aesthetic review for projects with like some significant amount of grading. Was Beacon on Fifth a critical slope?
I hope so, but I don't recall.
Fair, I
mean,
mean, that definitely seems like one
It's
that's.
pretty slopey.
Yeah,
Mayor
It
Smith?
may have been before. Oh, I don't want to speculate too far.
yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it sort of seems like what we're looking for is, or what we seem to be talking about is like aesthetic review, and like you need to be late enough to like have a rendering at that point, and then somehow hold them to it.
Well, there's also the environmental values that you're gonna be balancing against as well,
Yeah.
Separate from stormwater.
separate from stormwater, yeah. Well, or connected to stormwater, but more generalized, but also protecting the trees. I mean, what we're stripping out is just that technical analysis of stormwater flow and how you're gonna, you know, capture, treat, and so on.
retain
what's
it,
your
how long
volume
you
of
have to
water that
retain
you need?
it, and-
Right.
yeah,
Okay.
Just
I don't know.
engineering.
We'll play with it for a bit.
Yeah.
Mayor Snick, do you have thoughts on this topic?
The one thought that I have, and in the 2.5 years I've been on city council, there have been a number of times when critical slope waivers have come before us, and I can't remember more than 5 minutes total discussion of the merits of the issues, largely because, frankly, I think we tend to defer to those who have looked at it before. It's important, it sounds to me as though it's important that someone who knows what they're doing be the arbiter of these kinds of things, but I have yet to see one that said to me that city council needed to be the arbiter.
For my own thoughts, I'd like to encourage a focus on health and safety as we talk about this as an issue. It's a complex and there are many issues, but I think we're strongest when we stand on health and safety. Often we find ourselves talking about trails at this step. Very often there's a connection to trails plan, and that conversation happens then. I don't know that that's necessarily, that linkage is important, but having trails as part of the conversation I think is important. I'm concerned that this may be duplicative with other forms of aesthetic review, or better addressed with other forms of aesthetic review. So I think it may be helpful to look at that as a more efficient vehicle. Any additional comments or questions on this item?
No, I think it makes sense, pushing that technical stuff back before, I mean, when you're thinking of a design process, they might come to us earlier in the process to make sure that they can disturb the critical slopes. It makes sense to do that, that early, and we don't wanna wait until they have the stormwater done, when it's too late to change stuff. So I agree. I don't know if it's an aesthetic process, though. It takes into consideration environmental. It's not just like massing and height and that kind of stuff. So I would be hesitant to call it that.
Yeah, I'm having some heartburn with everything that sort of like aesthetic being this blanket thing and also being sort of like a bad thing that like someone else should be worried about, because there are things like with health and safety and good design and environmental protection that are more than just aesthetic, like that encompass more than just aesthetic review.
Additional questions and comments on this?
Are our actual like designated critical slopes like up to date? Like, I assume when we first did this, we did some sort of topographic analysis to make sure, and I wonder if that's,
That would certainly need to be part of looking at critical slopes again, because there's, the other place where there's a lot of time spent is in contesting whether or not something is a critical slope.
Right, there are two different definitions between the subdivision and the zoning ordinance, and so we have to maintain two separate maps, and we have to evaluate both, yeah. So there could be some assistance there as well.
Next, please.
Okay, height. So there were a few questions, I think, from commissioners around height. It's a surprisingly complex topic. There's some information on pages 63 through 64 on different mechanisms for measuring height, but what I want to touch on here really is one of the ideas that's floated is to have essentially a contextual requirement built in that would say that, the district might allow a height of a certain number of stories and feet, but what the neighboring buildings are lower, that there would be a reset down closer to that lower height in the right area. So the example I give is the height standard might be 50 feet, but if if the buildings around average out at 30, the height requirement might drop down to 40. Now that raises issues of measuring those other buildings. You might need to just do it by story, and then assign the the feet, there's technical complications around that, but this is about creating essentially an automated, if you will, mechanism within the zoning ordinance that addresses contextual consistency with the surrounding context.
Mr. Mitchell? Mr. Abba?
Sure. So would that change over time? Like if the neighborhood builds up, then you can just go back and build up more and?
So that's why you set it higher. You don't set it to match, you set it higher, so now you've created a mechanism that also allows that to evolve, but it regulates the pace of evolution.
I guess my only concern, I'd have to see how that plays out, but we had this ambitious comprehensive plan of increasing all this housing. I just don't know what that would do to that.
Well, I think it would balance some of the fear that residents have that there's just going to be massive, structures popping up, looming over neighbors, right? I think that's a helpful tool, because I think sometimes we are looking at a project going, well, this does really seem kind of too high for this neighborhood, but the zoning allows for it, so I guess it's okay. I think that idea makes a lot of sense.
Mr. Landry?
Yeah, on the surface of it, it makes a lot of sense, but I can see the complications coming real quick. Well, what's context? Is it
Yep.
within 50 feet? Is it 100
Right.
feet? Is it right on the street? Can it be back from the street? When one goes 10 foot higher, how soon before you can build the next one 10 foot higher than that?
Right.
I'm glad you all are working this out.
Ms. Russell, did you have additional thoughts?
No.
Mr. Stolzenberg?
Yeah, I mean, I think I see some value in contextual heights. I agree with Commissioner Habab that, we need to do it very carefully so as not to, essentially override all of our other height recommendations. I think on our mixed-use corridors in particular, most of those are kind of like very thin corridors that we are hoping to put, we're thinking probably the bulk of the new housing on, so as to minimize disruption within neighborhoods, or at least the more you put there, the less pressure there is within neighborhoods. And if you force that to be too contextual to the differently designated neighborhoods next door, you lose that, right? I think there's value in things like bulk planes, but at the same time, I look at like 600 West Main that was built around two preserved historic houses on one lot, and then next door, 600 West Main Phase 2 that we approved a couple years ago, and how that's shaping up in BAR, and it's subject to the post 2015 contextual zoning that we put in on West Main, and it's going to be fewer units, even though it's a bigger lot with no preserved houses. It should just be a big rectangle, but instead it's shorter. It has weird step backs in the back, and step backs, while I think they have their purpose aesthetically at times, they also are just bad from a climate change perspective, right? It means more heat loss. It means you have more, walls and joints for rain to come in, and in that case, where it's facing the railroad track, and then a neighborhood even beyond that. I like the concept of bulk planes in general, but again, depending on how you implement it, can be really problematic.
I should note, between zoning districts, there's proposed to be language about transitions. So really, this contextual rule would be kind of within zoning districts.
Okay.
But everything you said about bulk planes potentially applies in that conversation about what those rules look like that manage transitions, so.
Yep, and then if you have a medium intensity zone that's currently a bunch of two-story houses, you're effectively saying that nobody can redevelop that into what we recommended as the height limit of 4 stories. until someone does a 3-story first, which was likely to not be economically viable because you're barely increasing the intensity on the site. And that seems like an issue.
Sure.
Mayor Snook, do you have thoughts on this one?
The one thought that I had actually is consistent with what Commissioner Stolzenberg had just said is I'm thinking about, and I haven't studied it in sufficient detail to have anything more than sort of an idle thought on it, but I'm thinking about what is likely to happen with whatever our new zoning is going to look like. It's going to be more intense than what we've got now, but we want to keep it with some sense of scale and however that gets worded. I share the concern that I'm not sure how we get from where we are now economically to where we think we probably want to be. And I want to make sure that the pros in this draft an ordinance that is sufficiently flexible that gets us there.
I have a couple of concerns on this item. Height, of course, is a huge issue in terms of aesthetics, but also in terms of affordability. If you want to raise prices, reduce heights, it's extremely powerful. So I'm concerned about the friction between our affordable housing and equity goals and height regulations, any additional height regulations, and any way that we can consider that trade-off critically in context. Additionally, I think there's maybe a useful difference between different kinds of frontages. A frontage on a busy road or a busy corridor could be different from a frontage on a utility corridor or a railroad track. So I think that if we are a little bit more precise in what kinds of frontages we care about, I think that may be helpful and give us a more useful result. I think I had one more. Oh, I do. Back to context. I'm thinking, there's been a lot of discussion about frontage on public housing or rear frontage on public housing in West Haven. And I think that's inspired a lot of this conversation. But also, we have many different kinds of places in Charlottesville. I'm thinking about the 29 area. How do we want to consider those relationships? Is that a priority of preservation, or is that an area where we can be a little bit more open and a little bit more flexible? So I'd encourage taking a context-sensitive approach when we think about these rules. I think they'll be more useful in some places than others.
Right.
Any additional ideas on this item?
Are we moving on from height or moving on from contextual height?
Ooh, good question.
We could keep
What's-
talking height.
Give me height.
Okay, last thing on contextual height. Austin has like notoriously onerous context requirements. So in the few places that they do have high density zoning, if it's something like 150 feet from a single family house, even if that single family house isn't zoned, is zoned also high density, it limits the height to something extremely low. Again, it's contextual height I think can make sense, but it's easy to do poorly. Kind of undermines the whole idea, sort of like IZ. Moving on from context, I feel fairly strongly that when we're talking about height, and we're regulating it because of its impacts on other people, on other properties, and people walking by, whatever, I do not see that health and safety benefit, or even any sort of externality related to number of floors. If we have a 50-foot building and it has 5 floors or 3 floors, that seems to have the same impacts visually on everyone else, right? And I think where this really becomes something I'm very skeptical of is within general residential, where Jenny, I think, made it pretty clear that 2.5-story limit we were talking about is still 35 feet when we discussed it last year. But 2.5 stories at 35 feet means 14-foot ceiling heights, which is a very tall ceiling height. I just don't Like, what are we doing there?
You're not required to build a 14-foot.
Sure, you can build it shorter, but then you should maybe either reduce the height limit to be a normal sized 2.5-story building, in which case I'd say, why are we reducing our height limits in the middle of a housing crisis? Or, at the very least, say, if we're gonna leave it at 35 feet, particularly if you add affordability or something, you should be allowed to have 3 or 3.5 stories, which would fit 3.5 stories would fit with 10-foot ceiling heights. And, in the text, it says, oh, well, the building code lets you go down to 7'8". And
It's
so-
gonna depend on what the definition of height is also, because where you take height on houses is the midpoint peak of the roof.
Mhm.
And so everyone gets a bonus
Yep.
already. And so, that's just another step to that has to be taken into account.
Yep, no, I mean, that's fair, that's a really good point. And obviously it'll definitely depend on that, but I guess I'm saying, let's not, if we're gonna do both, let's not end up in a scenario where your height limit is so much more than your floor limit that you're either telling people that your height limit's lower, or you need to have soaring ceiling heights. Because I don't get who benefits.
You don't, again, it's not saying that you need to have soaring, the height limit is a
Or a shorter
maximum,
building,
right?
yeah.
Right, so it's saying you can build 4 stories or up to a certain number of feet, right? You have to meet both. I'm sorry, you're capped by both. You could choose to do a 2-story building. You could choose to do a 4-story building within something less than whatever the height requirement is in that section.
Yeah, no, I mean, I get that you could just build a shorter building with normal ceiling heights, but I don't know why we benefit from the idea of allowing that extra height, but only if you do it by increasing your ceiling heights. You see what I
So,
mean?
Yeah, I guess I see what you mean. I mean, I guess what it's offering is flexibility to the developer to decide what kind of project they want to build, right? I mean, if you just do stories, you run the risk, you've got a defined story now, and how do you account for atriums and all of these kind of spaces that people can create within their space that could lead to buildings that are taller than what people are anticipating or expecting in a 4-story building, right? So that's why it's helpful to have the absolute height cap in feet. What I like about stories is that it's predictable for the general public, and it's easily measurable by the general public, right? They said that they're gonna build a 4-story building, and there, I can look at it, it's 4-story buildings. I can't verify it's 40 feet or 45 feet, but I can look at it and tell that it's 4 stories. When we set just a height cap, we may inadvertently be creating an incentive to kind of cram to a certain extent, right? To try and put more floors in. And maybe that's a good thing. But when I think about particularly in a mixed-use district, I want that first floor retail space to be 15 feet at least, right? And what I worry about, what I've seen actually, is a developer who doesn't really want to put in retail on the first floor, where we want retail on the first floor, build that as a 10-foot tall space, and then say, I'm just not able to rent it out. Can I go ahead and convert it over to residential?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point, though I would suggest that we should directly regulate the nature of ground floor spaces in mixed-use
has
areas,
to
especially
be-
if we're gonna allow residential.
Right.
And then I would say that cramming, if we're gonna call it that, is a good thing, and that means you can get more floor area, more units, more habitable space for people to live in the same building. I mean, if I'm the guy next door who's getting, to me, I imagine the guy next door, their concern about height is the shadow that's gonna fall on them, or their view being blocked, and that's the same no matter how many floors there are. They might separately have a concern about density, I suppose, but that's sort of separately addressed in our plan. And within that height, I would suggest that more habitable space is a good thing. But your point about the ground floor in commercial areas, I think is very well taken.
Right. And then, I mean, and the architects can probably speak to this better than I can, but in kind of modern construction, we tend to just build to the use that we're building to right now. I like to think about the longevity of buildings and their convertibility. Office space, particularly modern office space, requires higher floor-to-ceiling heights than residential, because you gotta introduce into that inner floor space all of the network connectivity and everything. So, or, you know, particularly if you're looking at lab space, like now you're really talking about major space between floors. So I do like to think about the longevity of these buildings, and so while I don't want to mandate necessarily a floor height, I want to create an opportunity, make sure we have an opportunity for floor height, so that the buildings can convert between uses over the course of a 100-year lifespan, that we might hope we start to get buildings that last that long. I'll leave it at that. I feel like I had another point, but I've lost it.
Any more on height? We've got parking coming.
Oh, on density, on density, to save us from talking about parking for just another second. We are talking about removing strict dwelling unit per acre requirements, right? And now it's more about defining the box, and then you get to figure out how many units you put in the box. So in that instance, thinking about floor heights and number of stories becomes more important. So, so we may not want to throw that one out if we're getting rid of dwelling units per acre. So,
I'm recalling that in the 2018 process, a big part of why we started talking about heights aggressively was inspired by the bonus height assessment, which found that the first 3 stories, very affordable. 4th story, pretty affordable. 5th story, anything above that, concrete, expensive.
well, right, because you're changing materials as you go up, right? Yeah, and there's a gap. It's very rare to see buildings that are 7 or 8 stories, because your material cost has skyrocketed, but your return on that cost hasn't skyrocketed sufficiently to cover it. At least that's how it's always been explained to me.
And I would argue that that's changing on a daily basis. They just certified a 270-foot high, all timber building, was just constructed in Wisconsin or Minnesota somewhere. So all
And
timber construction is happening. It's happened here in Charlottesville.
And is this form of timber cheaper? I really don't know. The timber,
You know, I don't know,
right.
Yeah.
but it's gonna get cheaper. It's like everything else, like these things that we play on.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Last call on height?
Just to maybe restate your point, I think what you're saying is, let's make sure we play to those, building code affordability like drivers. And if it's something like, I don't know, a 45-foot height limit, we want to allow that 4th story or whatever that you can still do with wood, because, fewer means more expensive.
Parking, please.
All right. So the question that was asked here was whether we could find further ways of illustrating the challenges and trade-offs inherent with parking, and we will look into that. There are various exercises even that you can do, just taking a typical lot and being tasked with laying out a building and then providing the parking for it according to some requirement, and recognizing that suddenly you don't have sufficient land area to work with, right? What we all know is parking can end up being a greater limiting factor on the number of units that a lot can accommodate than the zoning otherwise would indicate, right? So, there's a lot here. I mean, at the bottom line, we're looking at reducing parking requirements as kind of a starting point. But we want to continue to be open to and considering the notion of even eliminating minimum parking requirements. I think it's always important to note when we say that we're not eliminating parking. We're not saying you can't do parking, and most developers will do parking, right? We know that the downtown district has no minimum parking requirement, and each of these buildings has been constructed with some degree of parking. We also know that when you have a conversation about eliminating the minimum parking requirement, that means that you also need to, in parallel, think about having a more robust parking management program, right? Managing on-street parking or other available public parking resources in a more active way, whether that's with pricing or time or both together in some configuration. So why don't I close there and see what you guys have to say about parking?
Mr. Mitchell, parking?
Not much. I'm not as worried about residential parking as I am about public parking. I'll reiterate my mantra. We want Charlottesville to be a destination, a place that people from Crozet drive into. We want the people from Crozet to drive to the downtown mall and have dinner at Brasserie. The county is beginning to develop nodes, Crozet being one, where they're going to have their own little downtown mall-like scenarios where people don't have to drive into Charlottesville. And again, I'd like and one of the reasons that people don't want to drive into Charlottesville is because parking is difficult. So parking management is going to be important for bringing people into Charlottesville. Toby's. Good example. You guys have seen this commercial. It says how you guys hate Charlottesville, hate trying to find a parking place to park in Charlottesville. Well, guess what? We've moved to the county. So, as you're thinking about that, I'd ask you to think about, along with the residential parking, just parking management, so that we can keep people coming in from outside the city.
Right. The rule of thumb with parking management is you're aiming for 80% occupancy. At 80% occupancy, you're making good use of your investment in parking. Right, because that means you're making good use of all the money you're spending with, your maintenance of that parking lot. But there's always going to be availability, right? At 80% occupancy, that means you got 20% available. So when people show up, they're always going to find a space. Now, I think parking is one of those hot button issues because there's a perception of parking availability that doesn't always match the reality of parking availability. So I was about to go into an anecdote, but I'll leave it aside.
Thank you. Mr. Abad, please, parking.
I don't have anything.
Truly?
Well, I mean, I agree with trying to find ways to reduce parking, and I guess the question is, what is our parking occupancy right now? Do we know?
Oh, for downtown?
Yeah.
I don't know it off the top of my head now.
But the only thing I would say is, what Commissioner Hosea said is just realizing the impact on our parking, and if that works, then I'm all for it.
Mr. Landrieu?
I don't have anything to add either. No, I'm all for reducing parking, but I think the market will take care of it.
Ms. Russell?
Nothing to add.
Mr. Stolzenberg?
Yeah, I think needless to say, I support eliminating parking requirements, but I don't have any illusions that that will actually end up in some really massive reduction in how much parking actually gets built. I think developers are going to fit as much parking as they possibly can, and the more we can explore creative ways to help them get that parking in a tighter space while reducing impervious surface, the better, I think. I was happy to see tandem parking in here and to learn that it's actually allowed right now. It just doesn't count towards the minimums. If there's no minimums or if they're much lower, then it doesn't matter if they count or not. But if you have a 2-bedroom apartment and you both have cars, tandem parking spot isn't really that inconvenient, and the inconvenience falls on you privately and not the public. If there are other things like that that we could add into the ordinance to make it easier to cram that stuff in more and not have a bunch of extra asphalt, I think that'd be great. I can't think of any offhand.
Mayor Snow, thoughts on parking?
I largely shared Commissioner Mitchell's dichotomy between the residential and the downtown as two very different problems. I'll also note, although it's not directly related to zoning kinds of issues, well, actually it is related to zoning kinds of issues, that I think when we get around to drawing zoning maps, we need to also keep in mind where we're gonna be running transit lines, and that's gotta be a part of the decision of where to put greater density. Not direct, it doesn't have anything to do with the definitions.
A lot of people talk to me about parking. People talk to me about parking. Main concerns that I'm hearing about are impacts on highly sensitive areas, equity impacts, how this is going to interface with affordable housing development. My hope is that we'll allow more affordable housing development, but clarity on that could be helpful. Those are the big ones. And also, just generally, if we could get some revenue from parking, that would be lovely. We have real revenue problems.
Sure, and I mean, one of the big popular ideas that's out there in the same space as talking about reducing or eliminating parking minimums is the idea of parking benefit districts, right? Which is the notion that once you require people to pay for parking, that's how you basically put a residential parking permit in the neighborhood. Now you're regulating the number of cars that can park on the street, and you try and match that to the number of available spaces. But then the parking benefit district part of that is the money that people pay for that residential district, for that residential parking pass is rolled back into the district. It doesn't go into the general fund. It's used to pay for sidewalk improvements, street trees, the things that make for a nice walking environment within the neighborhood. So you're taking that money and you're rolling it back into the neighborhood to support the walkability of the neighborhood.
Exciting. Questions or comments on parking?
Back to my scope question. So in thinking about, parking permit areas, that sort of thing, our ordinance right now is written a little weirdly. It's all about commuter parking. Is that idea of rethinking those in scope here?
I think potentially. I think this becomes one of those questions of if we feel like the only way to move forward in what we're proposing is if we also address this, then yeah, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We've heard in the past from the Star Hill Neighborhood Association that they did not want residential parking permits, even though they have a real commuter parking problem because it's so onerous to get the permits themselves. I think I've heard a bit from 10th and Page that people are spilling over from Dairy Central who are going to the market there and want to avoid that lot where they have plenty of parking and are, fully met and exceeded the parking requirements. But unless there's some way to, I guess, fix the problem on those residential streets, people have real concerns. And we got to square that circle somehow, I think, as part of this.
And the point there that as you noted, they've exceeded the minimum parking requirement on that site. And I mean, just my own experience going there, I've never not been able to find a parking space in the lot, but I've seen that people are parking on the side streets. So a minimum parking requirement doesn't necessarily solve the problem of people parking on the side streets. And that is demonstrable over and over again, because we don't actually control where people go.
Let's call on parking.
But that's a paid lot, though.
I know, but I've never paid there.
Well-
And I just said that publicly.
That's the secret, but I mean, that would cause anyone that didn't know that to go and park somewhere else.
What's that?
Frontages, please.
They'll be looking
Chris
for you
Henry is
next
very
time.
unhappy you said that.
Off the record.
Luckily, there's only 10 people watching.
Sean Tubbs will pick that.
All right. The only other thing on this section is the EV parking. We are proposing to require conduits to be installed. We can't, for the other part of doing EV parking is that you actually have to provide the, went right out of my head, but essentially the electrical infrastructure, right? We can't require that. there are a lot of good reasons not to do it as well, but just to draw the hard line, that's a building code issue and we can't require that. But we can require the conduit.
Conduit's cheap.
Our belief is that that is covered under the building code, and if it's in the building code, it's not, it can't be in zoning. All right. Frontages. This is, actually, I will say, I'm gonna call you out, Mr. Chairman. We didn't actually know what your question was on frontages.
Oh, no.
But we responded with this, that they're highly variable downtown. And we recognize that one of the issues that needs to be creating greater consistency and predictability around what the frontage requirements are.
Flag lots.
What's that?
Flag lots. I was asking about allowing homes behind homes.
Okay, great. So that is something that we're talking about allowing within the zoning ordinance. Yeah, that's actually a kind of important idea because it creates more opportunities for more types of ownership.
Questions on this item? Next, please.
All right. There was a question about aging in place. We believe that the proposals in this zoning ordinance actually promote the idea of aging in place, because as we diversify the housing types available within our array of neighborhoods, we're creating more opportunities for somebody who wishes to downsize or move to single-floor living to be able to stay within the neighborhood and move into into a new home that meets their needs at whatever age they're at. I think that's an idea most of you all are familiar with.
Can I jump
Amenities?
backwards to frontages?
Sure.
Frontage maximums? For example, people, I think people's maybe most hated buildings in the city, the standard, the flats have very long frontages. We've kind of tried to break up the massing architecturally. I think some cities have explored just limiting like the frontage of your lot. I mean, maybe part of the problem with that is we already have these large lots, so if put it in the subdivision ordinance, it doesn't really help because they're already assembled, but is that something you've thought about at all?
Not in the context of this ordinance, but it's something I've worked on in previous ordinances, so we can bring that into play. We can take a look at that.
Cool.
Aging in place? I can only say that it's been a major public concern.
All right, an amenity space requirement, yes. We are proposing to include that. We would propose that over 4 units.
Sorry, I think that was my question, and I
was.
forgot to put the explaining part afterwards. I just wrote amenity space requirements. At least as currently constituted in the code, those are extremely onerous. In R3 specifically, it literally says amenities required for R3. And it makes R3 basically impossible to do anything that isn't like a very large apartment building, like, the ones you see off Shamrock.
Okay.
So I think the worst part is probably there's some requirement for like indoor, and then if there's 2-bedroom units or more, then there's like child space requirements. And if you're building a fourplex, like,
Right.
Where are you putting an indoor like playroom?
Right.
And I think from a project perspective, when you add those requirements, you're making things more expensive by requiring this shared space, or even if it's outdoor, like a yard, or
Right.
I think someone did a greenhouse to comply with it. I think that was technically an indoor one. And then from a public sort of morals perspective, I guess that part of our charge, you're like encouraging people to kind of turn inward into these private spaces rather than going out and using parks and public amenities and supporting the development of those. So in the diagnostic, it sort of went back and forth, but in places it talked about like a pedestrian or public amenity requirement, which I think does make sense probably for larger projects that are like larger than house scale. Something like the Standard could have like a courtyard, or I think like the corner plaza was was called out in the report. I think if it's amenities that are private and directed at people who live there, I feel like that should be up to, to the market to provide how much people want those on-site amenities versus, that like dog washing station and gym that no one ends up using versus, using public amenities.
Other questions or comments on public amenities? Residential testing, please.
Okay, hold on.
Of course. I'll race you.
All right.
We're almost there.
I kind of touched on this earlier, so I'm not gonna dig into this too deep, but I guess my question is, again, the sense I got back was the feeling that we didn't necessarily need to look at lots on curvilinear streets in a more suburban setting because that environment it's either reducing, that for the purposes of this testing, we had done what we needed to do. I guess what I need to hear from this commission is whether it would be helpful to you to see some example on a curvilinear street.
It would, if only for a perception issue. I mean, when you look through the draft and you see every lot, a grid lot, you immediately think, well, this doesn't have anything to do with my neighborhood. Doesn't have anything to do with my lot. Then you make up your own reason why. And I guess I just wondered, it hasn't been, so to my mind, it hasn't been tested. It hasn't been looked at. And when it talks about on grid patterns, putting 11 cars on the street for getting this percentage of coverage, and some of these neighborhoods, putting 11 cars on a street in these neighborhoods with curvilinear streets and narrow streets is just not feasible. So I'm wondering, does it need to be tested? And is there, and should it be included or should it be looked at just for perception issue? That's my thought. That's my concern.
I guess, how onerous would that be for you guys to add?
I'll have to check. It's not, I'm not gonna do it, but.
Well, what do you think? I mean, I read Jody's email back
Yeah.
again, so it just made sense. Do you agree or disagree, or what are we missing?
Where do I stand? There's something to be said for the perception aspect of this. The notion that these those neighborhoods of the city aren't somehow included or analyzed. I don't think they haven't been analyzed per se, but we haven't done a test lot in that nature. So I think what I'm going to weigh is I'm going to find out what it would take to do a couple test cases, looking at, I'm imagining medium and large lots. I don't know that there's any that would qualify in the small lot category in that space. I don't want to do too many test conditions. I don't want to do a, outside the curve, inside the curve kind of thing. But we'll take a look at it and find out what kind of time factor we're looking at to do it. We'll see where we end up.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
A type that jumps to mind is especially different is cul-de-sacs.
I know, I was thinking about cul-de-sacs as well, right, because and that's a very different site condition because of the narrowness of the, potential narrowness of the frontage.
Other questions or comments on this issue? Would you like anything else from us?
So I'll just note that based on public comment, some of the things we're already looking at doing, because we have gotten a great deal of public comment to date. One of the things that I want to clarify is on the future land use map, it references both the general residential and the medium intensity residential being house-scaled buildings, and we're not abandoning that principle. I think it was word choice in this document that suggested that there would be a general residential, a house-scaled set of districts or zoning district and a medium intensity zoning district. I think they were just struggling to come up with names. But that being said, it also brings to mind the idea of actually doing more to define what we mean by house scale. And so that is something that we're going to take up in the future editing of the document. Tree preservation, important issue. I'm all about trees and the value they bring. That's not even a question mark for me. But we need to do some more discussion and more, we need to devote some more work to that. I'm sorry, not work, more column inches essentially into the document, on that topic. And the same thing with climate change. It was pointed out to me that the word climate change doesn't show up in the report. But it's prominently within the comprehensive plan and it's clearly an issue of importance. So we need to make reference to that as well. There still seemed to be a lot of expectation in the comments we were getting that we're proposing to change or remove the BAR process. Can't state it enough. We're not making any changes to the BAR review process. And then also a lot of comments about stormwater, which I think just, again, reiterating the point that it's a separate section of the ordinance. And right now, we're not proposing any changes to those stormwater provisions. That's what we have right now in terms of some of the edits we're looking at, and I'm sure we'll have more. Any other questions generally that weren't covered so far?
Is there a way we can, I know we talk a lot about tree preservation and we kind of enforce canopy street trees. We might not have the legal ability to do that, but could we add trees instead of just preserve? Is there a way to encourage that?
Yeah, I believe so. Missy, do you have anything on that topic?
Meaning increasing the tree requirements?
I know from, the canopy studies that we do, canopy is continually shrinking. What can we do to kind of, instead of keep it where it is,
Sure.
start to build back up to where we were?
I think that's more than a zoning issue, right? And it's a challenging topic because one of the places where we're losing a lot of canopy is on the remaining large undeveloped parcels that have a lot of trees on them, right? That's part of where we're losing canopy. We actually had a meeting this morning where myself and a couple staff kind of dug deep into conversation around trees and what the issues are. And amongst the things we noted is that we have a lot of standards for trees that could do to be updated, right? Right now, we're operating under the state enabling legislation as to what we're allowed to do for preservation or requirements of tree canopy on any given site that's subject to a site plan review. We've already kind of maxed out what we're allowed to do under the state requirement. But we can do more to define how a tree that's being preserved is actually protected in the course of the construction and ultimately the building on the site. We can also, it's unclear, but we have some standards that give canopy credit to things like boxwoods and other shrubs. That shouldn't be in there. Unless somebody can come up with a reason why it ought to be there, but I can't come up with a reason. So there's a lot of stuff that's kind of, again, parallel to zoning as part of our development review process that we can look at. But then also outside of zoning is what investments do we have the capacity to make on planting street trees? Or otherwise planting more trees on public land where we can control the fate of the tree.
A question that keeps coming to me, maybe because my procurement background is just in my blood. Is there any way we can spend money to solve problems? Can we preserve slopes? Can we protect trees by spending money? If we know where they are, can't we just buy them?
Buy land?
Yeah, why not?
Right. Also not outside, also outside zoning, but yes, absolutely right.
But if the zoning is just trying to preserve these things that we say we want, why don't we just buy them?
I've got a tree thing at the intersection of zoning, SADM, and maybe Streets That Work. So, you know, I'm thinking about like some like east-west streets in Belmont that have like really wide rights of way, like 60 feet or something, where Streets That Work would be fine with it if it were, and the SODM if it were significantly smaller. Can we like require that trees be added to the right of way, just as we would require that sidewalks be built, rather than just, you know, street trees within the parcel? Potentially including, you know, changes to that right of way where you know, dig up a little bulb out of asphalt and put a tree in there.
Right.
You know, that gets tricky where you'd be potentially removing parking, but there are definitely streets where there would still be room for parking even on the outside of the bulb out. You know, I think developers would not love the idea of having to pay for the bulb out, but be very happy to save that land within their parcel. And then the tree gets dedicated to us, and we get to keep it and maintain it. And it actually provides shade on the sidewalk if it's on the, you know, north sidewalk, since it's on the street side.
Mhm.
Summary questions and comments?
James, how feasible is it in terms of my recommendation or my suggestion that how many lots develop to 60 to 73% lot coverage or part coverage in a lot? How many of those lots will it take before we start losing more tree canopy? And I know that's an incredibly difficult question to pin down, because how many trees are on the lot to begin with? But I'm just thinking about, especially these areas with the large lots, and where we have most tree coverage in the city, we start allowing that kind of coverage to happen, and we can't, you know, I don't want to depend upon the landowner, the goodwill of the landowners that save the trees. They're looking for the best financial return for developing that lot to 73%.
And it's not just developers either, though. I mean, part of the issue is our ability to control what people do with the trees on their property, right? Because we know people
Yeah.
take down trees all the time, irrespective, regardless of development.
Yeah, but when we allow 73%
Yeah.
coverage to start to happening.
Right.
That everyone can do that now. How long before the tree canopy starts disappearing even more?
Yeah.
That concerns me. The unexpected collateral effects
Mhm.
of looking for the greatest density. I'd rather go up than out. Protect the amount of trees, to protect the separation. But
One of the,
it's a concern, I don't know how you measure something like
Right.
that, how you test something like that.
because one of the other ideas we have talked about is also just giving a little more flexibility on things like setbacks where somebody is doing that to protect a tree, right? Because one of the things you end up, you know, you need to be able to, in order to protect an existing tree on a site, you need to protect the space all the way out to the drip line, right?
Yeah.
So that's a big land area. And if I've got a setback on the other side of the building that's forcing me this way, and I don't have any flexibility on that, we need to have the ability to kind of prioritize our values and say, okay, we can go a couple feet this way and get out of the drip line of this tree.
Yeah,
If we can have that kind of space, that's
I mentioned
helpful.
that in the presentation, the tree commission saw from
Yes.
someone about the zoning ordinance allowing some flexibility to keep the large canopy trees.
Right.
I'd love to see something like that
Mm-hmm.
be in the ordinance.
Yeah.
Final questions and comments?
I think there's an interesting intersection with parking stuff there too, right? Like if you look at the 73% lot coverage, most of that lot coverage isn't the buildings, it's the parking and the driveways to get to the parking. You know, and I wonder if there becomes a point where we start to think about, I'm still ambivalent towards these, but like parking maximums or at least like tree cover requirements that like, you know, are superior to and above any parking requirements that we keep. Where we say you can't just cover your whole lot with asphalt because there needs to be some trees. Or at the very least, you need to like put a canopy tree in the middle of it and shade the parking, something like that.
Mayor Smith, thoughts?
Nope.
I can't.
Generous. Do you have what you need? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, James.
Thanks.
I would consider a motion at this
Thank
time.
you.
Actually, I'm sorry. I would like to hear from the public, an additional opportunity to hear from the public before we close.
All right, we'll go with our current stance is we will call on individuals in the room in person, and then we'll call on someone in our virtual audience, and we will rotate back and forth to make sure that everyone has an opportunity. So do we have anybody in our in-person audience who's interested in speaking? Okay. All right, we do have person? All right. Chair, is it okay if our speaker comes forward?
Please.
Thank you to all of you and good evening. My name is Martha Smythe and I live on a cul-de-sac on Ridgewood, I live on Rutledge Avenue. And so I related to a lot of what was said. On the subject of the tree coverage, I think I've seen throughout town in different places where trees have grown big and gorgeous, but they're pushing up sidewalks and, you know, corrupting the roadway as well. So I don't know what the answer is to that, but I think it needs some careful thought and evaluation. And I don't know if we're allowed in a place with these Dillon laws, but if we're allowed to have ordinances to limit what homeowners do cut down. Pennsylvania was a serious states' right, personal property right state, and they had that. If it was more than 6 inches in diameter, you needed a permit from the township, and that was the end of it. So it prevented a lot of trees from being destroyed whimsically. I was curious what's considered a small lot. It was mentioned a couple of times in the discussion. And I have no idea how big or small. And in the zoning overall, I would hope that we would find ways to discourage these big developer projects from taking over neighborhoods. There is nothing in the concept of the slum that does that. And I think that's a grave exposure for our city, which we do value for its beauty and its charm. And that's not to say affordable housing isn't a big issue. That's a separate problem from destroying what is. I'm very much in favor of affordable housing, and our mayor knows that I've written letters about using city property in many places to do that. And I don't know where that will come out, but it's an important consideration in my mind. I love the idea of testing the concepts, and the people that I've been talking to are concerned that there are very few illustrations of what some of these major changes would look like. You know, if we did this, then what do we have? And I think that the testing can get us one step closer to having those illustrations. It seemed to me with the changes or even just the questions of existing processes that we have, that it would be really useful to simply flow chart those. Simple way of illustrating where you'd go, when you go, and where you have options to make changes. Let me see, last one, I'm sure I could come up with more, but I'm out of time. Last one is this aging in place. I think we're oversimplifying the experience of the seniors in the community, because when people live in a home and they love it and they want to stay, yes, being able to stay in a new place in the back is great, but it's also a big job to bring in contractors, architects, what have you. It's not something that a person who's struggling with the idea of what do we do with grandma's china and, you know, oh, what about these antiques we got from mom? I mean, all that stuff that people have to deal with in downsizing as they age, take a lot of energy and really depress a lot of my friends. So I'm just thinking that expecting them to willy-nilly develop an ADU that they're going to live in is kind of unrealistic. So thank you for your time. I appreciate being up here.
Thank you. Do we have anyone online?
Yes, we do. Ms. Medcalf?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm Vicki Metcalf. I'm on the Tree Commission, and I'd just like to say that we would be very concerned about any changes that would weaken critical slopes protection. A waiver decision involves weighing the public benefits of the undisturbed slope, and that would include tree canopy. It's not just a technical decision to be made by staff. It should be made by the Planning Commission with public notice and an opportunity for public input. Thank you.
And in person?
All right. All right, Mr. Emery is our next in-person speaker.
You know, the Tree Commission has been advocating, educating, and advising regarding the necessity of tree canopy for the city since 2011. Despite the Commission's faithful and relentless work, the canopy coverage in Charlottesville is decreasing at a time when we have an ever-increasing need for the services that trees provide. The actions of leadership and departments have failed to stem the continued loss of canopy in the city. We must adopt additional strategies. I have two recommendations I hope you'll consider. Number one, incentivize property owners to create tree canopy. Provide a credit to real property owners based on their parcel's canopy coverage. The credit could be used to reduce the stormwater utility fee on that same property. This recommendation would need to be balanced so that the Water Resources Protection Plan continues to receive funding, the funding stream necessary to do its work. Number two, strengthen code items related to the establishment, maintenance, and extension of the urban forest. This is an important quality of life issue for Charlottesville citizens. For example, require 50% canopy coverage like Mr. Stolzenberg was recommending in parking lots. Well, I don't think he said 50, but they do that in Sacramento, and it just makes tremendous sense. Now, I understand that the diagnostic approach report's first step towards a new draft zoning ordinance. Its coverage of urban forestry management issues is currently vanishingly small. Additions must be contemplated and incorporated. I would just recommend that you listen to your tree commission. Thank you.
And thank you. Do we have someone online?
If there's anyone who's interested in speaking in our virtual audience, please raise your hand. All right, Chair, we do have a new additional speaker, Mr. Benjamin Heller. Mr. Heller, are you able to hear us?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, sorry. I wanted to make a quick comment on parking. I think, it's great to reduce the amount of parking required. That reduces costs, construction, and I think, our affordable housing problems have a lot to do with the cost of housing production. The only thing I would say is we want to actually, not just reduce parking, but reduce car ownership. If you reduce parking requirements and you don't actually reduce car ownership, I think you're giving up the environmental benefits and you're externalizing costs onto streets. So I hope that whatever you do with respect to parking recognizes that risk of externalizing the cost to neighborhoods by moving cars onto streets, and whether that's dealing with it through residential parking permit programs or some other way. It's a really important thing to consider because we don't want to just have the same number of cars, the same amount of driving simply moved from behind a building to on the street. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else in person? Commissioner Duranzio, looking at you.
I assume that I will have ample opportunity future times. There are several topics here that were of interest to me, but I'm more metaphysically certain I'll be able to expound upon.
Grateful to hear it.
All right.
Online?
Do we have anyone from our virtual audience? If you're interested in speaking in our virtual audience, please raise your hand. We don't have any additional hands raised.
I'd like to close the public comment.
Oh. You're gonna let it come through?
Please.
All right, Kay Bishop?
Hi there. I have a very general question, and maybe this is more a zoning rewrite question, but it's hard for me to address comments to the diagnostic report without knowing what the general consensus is around this question. And my question is, will currently in R1 zoning, that there's a residency requirement to exploit increased density or units, ADUs and accessory apartments, when the zoning rewrite happens, is the thought process that general residential and general residential sensitive will continue to have those residency requirements from a homeowner? Is that out of bounds for this meeting? I apologize if it is. That's my question.
Your question is noted. We can't get into back and forth at this time, but thank you. Any additional public comment?
Can we suggest someone to email or an email address for her to get that question?
Yes. Is that acceptable?
Yes.
Great.
So
Thank you.
Go ahead. Do you want to suggest that Ms. Bishop can reach out to me and happy to address the question?
Can you please reach out to NDS staff on this?
is that freesj@charlottesville.gov?
Directly.
FREASJ.
Did not have your email off the dome, sorry.
You want to give your personal home phone?
Is there no additional questions?
We don't have any additional hands raised at this time.
I'd like to close public comment at this time. Thank you. I would be interested in a motion.
Move to adjourn.
And I'll second it.
Can I get thumbs? I see thumbs. Good night all. Thank you.
Good meeting.